We tested every black ink. Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. It's Niko from Yoseka here today, and we have a very interesting topic. This morning, Daisy and I took an hour and a half and we swatched every black ink that's at Yoseka. So we tested 27 inks. There were a mix of dye-based and pigment-based inks. And we covered a lot of the major brands such as Platinum, Sailor, Pilot, and so on and so forth. So in this video today, I'm going to go through and talk a little bit about our chart, how we tested these inks, and then we'll go through and talk a little bit about what each of these tests means as for the qualities of the ink. And then I'll talk a little bit about standouts, interesting things we noticed from this test, and the conclusions we were able to draw from doing it. Okay, so first up is our chart here. I'm gonna go through and explain each section just so you guys can get an understanding of how we created this. So we have a box and then some lines under them for each ink. The top half of the box is for a swatch, which we did with a muddler. The bottom half, we did a dry test in. So we waited 30, 60, and 90 seconds after drawing each line before going in with a Q-tip and swabbing it to see how much it smudges. Then below that, we just have the brand name as well as the collection and ink color. So why are these the things that we chose to test? Well, the swatch is a great way of seeing if the ink is shading, how opaque it is, any qualities it might have. We saw some interesting colors come out of some of these inks that you don't exactly notice when you're just writing with it with like a smaller nibbed pen. Then the drying test is great for, first of all, seeing of course how quickly an ink will dry if you're someone who writes often, but the drying test is also a great way to see how wet or dry the ink is. The dryness and wetness of inks does also factor into how they feel when they're writing. So a wet ink will feel quite a bit smoother, it'll lay down nicely, whereas a dry ink, depending on what you're writing with, may feel a little bit scratchy, may run out quicker, things like that. So from doing the swatch test as well, we saw some really interesting undertones emerge from some of these inks. For example, the Sailor Shikiori Kazakiribane ink was very purple when we laid it down in the swatch. Also, some like the Sailor Shikiori Subeirakashi, the Robert Oster Graphite and Grunschwartz, and the London Toolbar Silky also showed some really interesting colors if you look up closer at their swatches. Some even developed a sheen after they dried, such as the Diamine Onyx Black and the Teranishi Guitar Antique Black. Another thing we're able to observe from these swatches is the darkness of these. Now you might be wondering why this matters, and I think especially if you stick to smaller nib sizes such as extra fine, fine, and medium, these are qualities that are a little bit harder to see because the line is a bit finer. But as you move on to things like broad or even calligraphy nibs, you do notice that the darkness does play a role. So if you want the color to be very opaque, looking at how the inks swatch is a great way of seeing how they'll lay down. Two of our most standout blacks, I would say, were the Platinum Carbon Black and actually the Kaweco Pearl Black were both very dark on our swatches. When we look at the dry times too, we did have some that were exceptionally smudgy, indicating that they were a much wetter ink, and some that were not very smudgy, indicating that they were a bit of a drier ink. Something to note with this as well is that whether the ink is dye-based or pigment-based does also play an element into this, as pigment-based inks often are drier and therefore dry quicker, but of course can then be a little bit dry and maybe scratchy to write with depending on the tool you're using. So some that dried very quickly were the Sailor Kiwaguro, the Diamine Forever ink, whereas if we look at some of the ones that smudged more, indicating that they're a bit wetter, you'll see that the Kaweco Pearl Black, the Sailor Manyo Chigaya, and the Dominant Industry No. 100 were definitely more on the wet side. As for my standouts, so this was obviously like the most black inks I've ever sat down and tried out once, and I think it was really interesting to see which ones were enjoyable to write with. I really enjoyed writing with the London Toolbar Silky ink. The Teranishi Guitar is a little bit on the wetter side, although I do think it does dry down pretty well after a bit, but these are kind of sheeny, so there's that to them. But those are always really nice to write with. And then also the TWSBI Black was very enjoyable to write with for me as well. We had a lot of fun doing this, and if you enjoyed this video, let us know below what color we should do next, or if you have a favorite black ink that we didn't mention in this video, we'd love to hear about it in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next video. Bye!